Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Scott Taylor. I'm the Dean of the Pardee School, so it's a real pleasure to see you all here this afternoon. Thanks for bearing with us as we kind of get settled in here in the Kilichan Honors College hosting us. I want to thank my colleagues for arranging this talk this afternoon. We in the school are, as a global studies school and international relations program, are obviously engaged in issues around the world that affect politics, policy, conflict, etc. As a campus, and I think perhaps predictably and not inappropriately, we have focused a lot on the struggle in Israel-Gaza, to a far lesser extent on that in Ukraine. But one of the world's great conflicts that's going on right now, as all of you know, that is less spoken about, less covered in the media, gathers considerably less attention diplomatically, in terms of peacekeeping operations, in terms of our global dialogue about conflict resolution, and about human suffering, is the conflict in Sudan. For those of you in the room who have followed it, you're keenly aware of this inattention to one of the most dire humanitarian crises and severe conflicts in the globe today. And so, as a school, it's incumbent upon us to shine a light on this, to engage in dialogue, to provide perspectives on this largely unseen crisis. And so it's a real privilege for us to have today my friend and colleague, John Prendergast. I had the privilege of knowing John for more than 20 years and working with him and watching him work as a policy maker, a policy influencer, a human rights activist, a leader in a lot of these sort of forgotten or untold and uncovered conflicts, particularly in the African continent. John has brought attention to the crisis, now somewhat abated, in the Great Lakes region. In the Congo, has worked done tremendous good work and activism in and on the Congo. It was as the founder of the Enough Project, which was a very vibrant, public-facing activist effort to bring attention to that crisis and to change legislation about how we deal with conflict minerals and so on. And now as co-founder of the Century, focusing on crises such as that in Sudan. So John has had a public profile for even far longer than I've known him, and is a respected voice, not just in Washington, but around the world. I think you were in the crisis group when we first met. Yeah. Previously at the International Crisis Group. I'm not going to go through his very long resume. He's an author, has written books that would make more books that would make a scholar's blush, and so just a very, very impressive person and very engaged in these issues. And so there are few better who can come and engage in a dialogue with us this afternoon about the ongoing struggle in Sudan and how to, how maybe we can get more involved and shine more of a light on it and go about the important work of trying to address this crisis. So, John, thank you so much for coming up and being here with us, and look forward to your comments and to engagement with you all. Even though no one's in the first two rows, we'll reach back and engage you in discussion this afternoon. So thanks very much.
Thanks, my friend. I appreciate it. Is it okay? Can you hear me okay, or do I need to do this? I need to do it. All right, got the nod. All right, here it is. How's that? We good? Yeah, friendship. It's interesting, nothing clarifies who's your real friends until you get married. Then you got to choose who's going to come to the wedding. And I said to my wife, my to-be wife, there ain't no way I'm getting married without Scott being there. So he was there, and we've been great friends for a long, long time, and I'm honored to come up and see your new digs, and I'm so happy that he's here at Boston U. It's a great school, so it's wonderful to be here. So let me start by telling you a story. Someone I met, a woman named Amina, in a refugee camp in Chad, right on the border of Darfur, Sudan, and Chad, western Sudanese border. She had 4 kids, was living in North Darfur in a little village, woken up one at the crack of dawn by a sound of bombs exploding in the center of her town, of her little village. She ran outside to see what was happening, and then heard the terrifying sound of horses coming, so that meant the militia were on their way. She grabbed her 4 kids and started running. There was a set of hills in the background in nearby, and thought that maybe that could provide with trees, that provide some level of some place to hide. And so she made it a couple hundred yards, and one of the militiamen swooped in on horseback, came down, grabbed one of her children, 4-year-old Assam, and with one motion hurled him into one of the burning huts that they had set on fire. She could hear the boy shouting, screaming for his mom, but she had the other 3, so she had to make a choice, Sophie's choice, like, what do I do? So she grabbed her 3 kids and kept her going, heading towards the hills. And then another 100 yards or so by her description, another one of these militia members swooped in on her, and she dove on top of the 3 kids, trying to provide some level of protection to them, but he grabbed one of the kids and shot him right in front of her. And then whatever was diverted and ran and rode away. And then she grabbed their other 2, and they made it to the hills. Then they trekked 7 days, I think it was, to the border, and she was living under a tree, hadn't been registered yet by the United Nations for the refugee camp when I met her on the border. And we talked a long time that day. She told me all about her story, about her life before, and the attack, and her dreams and how they were shattered, and what now she was contemplating in terms of her next steps. And she ended our conversation. Eventually ended it as the sun was setting, and we had to go. She said, she looked at me very, very intently and said, now that you know, you must do something. And that summarizes to such a great extent, really, for any of us in this room who care about any issue. When you receive an edict like that, you have to, I believe you have to dedicate your life to trying to make a difference about it. So, believe it or not, that was 20 years ago. And I only bring that story up because, incredibly, it's happening again. And I think you wouldn't be here today if you weren't roughly aware that this kind of genocidal activity, genocidal violence, is occurring again in Darfur and other parts of Sudan. There are eyewitness accounts by the hundreds recorded by Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and a number of Sudanese organizations describing the kind of attacks, very specific race-based, identity-based attacks that Amina had described to me so many years ago. And Scott mentioned Gaza, and not to compare, but there really is no parallel globally right now. Ukraine, Gaza, any of these places that in terms of scale and scope compares to what is happening, what is unfolding today in Sudan. And I'll just briefly mention 4 categories, but there are so many other aspects of human suffering that are tearing that war-torn country to pieces. Number 1 is famine. Famine has been declared in some sublocations in Sudan and would probably be declared in other places if we had any access to some of these areas. Millions of people will likely die over the course of the next 6 months. That's not me sort of speculating. That's the best demographic study that has been done to date, making that assessment. The problem is we can't measure it because we have no access to so many of the places where the situation is worst for the people. And so we don't know. We don't have no way to count the dead. We have no way to even count those in many of these places where the children are severely malnourished. They're trying to extrapolate from the places we can access. The second factor is genocide. When people are targeted on the basis of their identity, which is what is happening now in not just Darfur, but as I said, in other parts of the country, primarily by the militia force that was the same militia that attacked Amina 20 years ago, then known as the Janjaweed, now as a paramilitary force called the Rapid Support Forces, RSF. Got to be probably the most destructive military force in the world in terms of human consequences. The third category is massive sexual violence. Again, uncountable, but every field assessment done in some of these places by independent sources, so in non-governmental organizations, whether they're Sudanese or international, the epic levels of sexual violence are occurring. And then finally, the number we can measure to some degree, human displacement, the number of people that have been rendered homeless by the war is, I think, larger than anywhere else in the world, somewhere in the neighborhood of 11 million. Every week it changes, it increases. This is fundamentally a war, and this is what I've sort of come to in all the years, 20 years before I met Scott and the 20 years since. I've sort of concluded that so many of these places where there are these extraordinary conflicts just tearing the countries to pieces have a similar phenomenon, which is that of a captured state, where the state has been hijacked by a group of people and their international collaborators, and the state aid institutions are repurposed for private gain. They turn the countries into massive looting machines. Sudan's loot was previously oil, which drove decades and decades of war, finally leading to the secession of the world's newest country, South Sudan, taking much of the oil away with it, and then quickly pivoted once the oil was gone to gold. And gold is a massive component of this current conflict, billions of dollars being earned and smuggled out of the country to 99% of it to the United Arab Emirates with no consequences. So it's a war over a captured state, over a kleptocracy. Kleptocracy, the word meaning rule by thieves. And it's not just this, again, I want to stress, it's not just the Sudanese who are stealing. It is their international collaborators. We'll talk in a minute about that, where networks of people and interests see an extraordinary means to enrich themselves and use massive violence to ensure that the system stays in shape, in place. So the fighting is over, in my view, largely, to wildly oversimplify it, but not, I don't think, distort it, is between two major factions who are fighting over control of this looting machine, over control of this captured state. Who gets the spoils of war? Both of them have extensive networks of previously established looting mini machines related to different aspects of the national economy and what's left of it, but mostly the natural resources that they're looting. And they want what the other one has. They want it all. So they've subcontracted I mentioned the Janjaweed as the militia that attacked Amina's village and that become the RSF. The government 25 or 20 some years ago subcontracted its security to these militias. And the Frankenstein monster they created is now ripping the country to shreds. Gone is the simplicity of the Cold War. You know, I think it was an easy story for many of these conflicts, not just in Africa but around the world, where the Soviets were on one side and the Americans were on the other. There were other actors in the mix, but the big chessboard was driven by that logic. Today, there are so many different regional players who are pursuing their own interests in Sudan. And you see the United Arab Emirates as a major player, the biggest backer of this Janjaweed turned RSF militia, where they have set up an arms depot right across the border in Chad, not far from where I met Amina, and they set up a hospital just as a front. Imagine, we've all heard of front companies. They have a front hospital. And the arms cut across the border to the RSF, and then they use them to commit genocide. The United Arab Emirates also buys, as I said, most of the conflict gold from Sudan. The Saudis are involved, the Egyptians, the Turks, and then Russia started out on the side of the RSF, the militia, but over time, when they realized they couldn't win it outright, their desire to have a base on the Red Sea to undermine primarily oil traffic going through to the Red Sea into the Indian Ocean led them to change sides. So now they're supporting the government army. I hate to use even the word government because it's just the remnants of the armed forces are fighting this militia. There's no government and shouldn't be recognized as such, but it is. And so the Egyptians are heavily backing the army, and the Iranians are, for many reasons. We can go into all that in the Q&A for those of you that are interested as to why each of these, what are the motivations. But none of them are motivated to support serious peace negotiations or bring about influence on the party they support to negotiate in good faith. That's not happening. Another phenomenon is the lack of accountability, and this is true in so many different conflicts around the world today, so it's not a phenomenon that has no equal. Human rights crimes that are committed in the context of this war go completely unpunished. There's no consequence, no one pays a price for carrying these things out. There's no respect for any agreement. Sometimes they sign agreements, oh sure, we'll let aid in here, we'll do this or that. No respect for them. And I think that the reason for that is that the incentives, for those of you that do political science, the incentive structures, the incentives are loaded towards violence, towards looting, towards authoritarianism. There's no real incentive for cooperation, for making a deal to save the country, to create better transparency and governance, to rebirth, if that's a word, the institutions of the state, like the health delivery system, the educational system. Where none of these guys have that in their mind, It's all a free-for-all for the resources. Peacekeepers who were there, set up many years ago, were booted out, and there's no prospect for return. There was a UN Security Council meeting yesterday. The Secretary General, cowardly, wouldn't even propose, because he knows the politics, wouldn't even propose that there ought to be some limited force in. I mean, go down fighting for what you're supposed to stand for, but nah, maybe he wants a second term. And so the Security Council, with China and Russia on one side and the French and the British and the Americans on the other, as the permanent members, hopelessly stalemated, no chance for action there. That would be true almost anywhere in the world right now, unfortunately, in terms of the UN role, UN Security Council role, let's say. So the main levers of the international response system are completely ineffectual, almost irrelevant. You know, the UN Security Council resolutions, when they do issue them, are so watered down by Russia because of the threat of veto, so they get to the lowest common denominator. Like, wouldn't it be nice if there was some aid that flowed to people who are starving? That they might let through. But that's basically what you're going to get. No chance for any kind of UN force to protect civilians, any of that stuff that would be so obvious as a need. Sanctions are another tool, but the problem is that they impose sanctions on individuals, one-off sanctions here and there. People don't do business in their own name. Mass looters, they have front companies and cutouts, and it's so it's almost a badge of honor when you say, okay, that particular army guy, that particular militia guy is going to be sanctioned now, and it doesn't have any impact on his finances, his business capacities, and now he's like, can say, oh, look at me, they're trying to get me, but they can't do anything to me. I'm above it. So that really kind of almost backfires, and the mediation is, I mean, the U.S. and a number of other countries teamed up recently to have negotiations in Geneva, and the army didn't even show up. They don't care. The U.S. is not utilizing any leverage, and neither are most others, to try to bring people to the table, even though their intentions might be good in terms on the mediation side. On the other hand, the Sudanese grassroots response, the response by Sudanese civilians, has been extraordinary. In 2018, 2019, it was in the headlines what the courageous Sudanese effort to try to bring down the dictator at the time, Omar al-Bashir, successful, a peaceful revolution that led to the demise of this 30-year dictator who had built the kleptocratic system that is now being fought over. And there was this moment of extraordinary hope because the Sudanese people had risen up and successfully deposed this heinous ICC indicted dictator. But the systemic forces within the army and that militia slowly closed ranks, and it was within a couple of years as if nothing had changed. The system itself hadn't been affected. The guy at the top, the Titanic deck chairs, whatever you want to say, had been rearranged, but the system was unaltered. And everyone had gone home in the international community thinking, wow, this is great. We don't have to worry anymore about Sudan. But not understanding that little thing they saw above the water was simply the tip of the iceberg. The iceberg itself completely unmelted. Today, again, what aid is getting to people on the ground is mostly being done by Sudanese and the organizations they've formed. The emergency response rooms, as they call them,
have been established, nominated for, but didn't win it, but nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize last month. Again, like they're just being, brutalized and threatened and attacked, but they are the primary purveyors of humanitarian assistance, keeping people alive in a number of places throughout Sudan. And again, extraordinary courage, but very little backing in the way of the international community. So what's missing from all this? I think my 40 years of trying to figure it all out, and everybody has their own views, and maybe some in here will have alternative views, which I would love to hear them once we get to the discussion. But I believe the missing piece of that could potentially move the needle in a positive direction is what I would summarize as leverage. The influence. How do you influence the calculations of officials on both sides of this war? And let me just say parenthetically, there's other elements in the war. It's not just those two parties. There are groups on the ground that are allied with the two parties that make it more complicated. But in general, it's these two parties. But I believe that the calculations, it's all about that, how we see calculations being influenced. And if the incentive structure is so primed towards violence and there is no counterweight, why would we expect anything different? But if you start to create or you undermine the benefits of violence and the benefits of looting, well, maybe then you might begin to address that. So I think there are, and when we see what I would talk about here as what's within the realm of the possible, because of course we could sit here and say, gee, there should be a force of 100,000 people that go in and protect civilians. That's simply not going to happen. It's not possible. It's politically impossible. But what is possible is to in surveying the terrain, you look at when we are serious. And that's a big when and if. When the international community, or at least that cares about, or at least professes to care about human rights, utilizes tools, policy tools. When you look at how the response has been to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you look at how the world responded to Iran's march to get a nuclear weapon, you look at how the world has organized around, has over the last 15 years tried to organize around North Korea's attempt to gain nuclear capabilities. You see these tools of financial you see the world, how it galvanized around an anti-Al-Qaeda and anti-ISIS agenda. You see these tools of financial pressure are central to that. Sanctions, I already ridiculed one-off individual sanctions, but what is used when the world is serious are sanctions called network sanctions. When you assess and investigate and research what the networks are that are behind an individual key player, and then you sanction the entire network so that family members that are being used as cutouts, companies that are front companies, banks, mining, whoever it is that's facilitating and enabling this behavior and this looting and this activity pays a price and gets shut out of the international financial system. Then you're talking about having an impact. So the tools of financial pressure are principally these network sanctions, anti-money laundering measures. These are hardly ever used for human rights purposes, but they are occasionally. And what the importance of an anti-money laundering measure, so usually the U.S. Treasury Department and then other finance departments around the world, allies, will issue, especially those dealing with euros and British pound, will issue advisories to the banks around the world and say, here's the typology of money laundering that is occurring in in this particular conflict or in this particular crisis. We are now putting you on notice that if you do not monitor this and identify it and root it out of your banking system, not just your bank, but the banks that you do business with, the regional and local banks you do business with, we're going to come after you. We're going to fine you. In some cases, millions, in some cases, billions of dollars. This is very effective. And when it's been utilized, so it has had a tremendous impact, again, shutting people out of the international financial system, creating consequences. In and of itself, to me, worthwhile, but also a point of leverage if you're trying to get people to get to the negotiating table. So I think we have tools, we just haven't used them because it isn't important enough for all the reasons Scott said in his introduction. And so I think we have a role in this, we people that care about this stuff. And you see it over and over again where activism has made a difference. Like another day we should come back and talk about all the times when people like us in this room have said, no, this is just wrong. And let's organize, and people organize in a town, in a city, in a country, globally, and make a difference. And so in the case of Sudan, in the case of Darfur 20 years ago, some of you know, there was quite a large public outcry and effort to try to bring attention to and change the situation on the ground, change the policies that might make a difference in changing the situation on the ground in Sudan. And I just want to mention one aspect of that. At that time, so today, probably the biggest offender from the international system in terms of fueling the fire, just pouring gasoline on Sudan's fire, is the United Arab Emirates. But back then, mid-2000s, China was the big. They were in the oil sector, and they were the big player. And it so happened that in 2006, China was to host. Beijing was going to host the Olympics, and it was a big coming out party. The Chinese regime believed that this would be a way for them to show a new face of China at the time, and it was very important to them, their reputation around that opportunity not be besmirched by anything going on in the world. And so a coalition of activists all around the world decided, let's do whatever we can to dent that reputation, using the fact that China was the biggest supporter of the regime committing a genocide in Africa, and dubbed the Genocide Olympics. And my partners in crime at the time, still somewhat, Clooney and Don Cheadle, we went to meet with Steven Spielberg because he had been hired by the Chinese regime to be the director of the Olympics. He was going to direct the opening and closing ceremony. The money was literally unlimited, as they wanted this spectacle, bar none. And we went to him and said, listen, you, Megan, what was the name of the movie? Oh my gosh, Schindler's List. You put this extraordinary amount of money and time and energy into the remembrance of the Holocaust in many different institutions. I mean, he's done a tremendous amount. You can't be part of this. And he thought about it for a long time, not a long time, a couple of weeks, and he bailed. He very publicly resigned. And we had all kinds of people doing high-profile people saying all kinds of things about China. And slowly, steadily, their policy changed, and they altered. And the response, the impact on the ground, was that the Sudanese regime, which had much experience in using starvation as a weapon, where they would just simply say to the NGO, non-governmental organizations, and the United Nations, you cannot deliver aid to this area, and they'd close it off, and hundreds of thousands of people would starve. They did this throughout the North-South War, and had done it in the previous times in Darfur. And they stopped their policy of blockage. I mean, of course, the rhetoric continued and all the rest of it, and still fighting. I would say hundreds of thousands of people, maybe more. Maybe you could say seven figures of people are alive today because of that. alive in a horrible situation, yes, granted, but it was something, and activists had something to do with that. Today, the China of today is, as I said, the United Arab Emirates. What is their weak point? Because everybody has one. They also care about their reputation, and they've spent a lot of money, billions, on the concept of sports washing. Many of you would understand that, know what that means, where they invest in leagues and teams all over the world on different. I mean, these guys, they make the Saudis look small compared to what they've been doing. They're in anything you can name it. The English Premier League and the Spanish League, the football, the NBA, major investors in the NBA. The next month, the mid-season, in-season tournament called the in-season tournament last year is going to be called the Emirates NBA Cup this year because they just bought it. What's it? WWF, whatever that is, World Wrestling Federation, deep in. Horse racing. Oh, they love the horse racing in England. So that's another. Name the sport, they're in it. Formula One. They just hosted I don't know anything about auto racing, but they hosted the latest one, whatever that was, wherever it was. So they're deep in. But this is indicative that so we have the little merry band of activists tried to bring the group back together again from the 20 years ago. Much diminished, it's much smaller now. It's not in the news. So at least it was in the news what was happening 20 years ago, right? And we just launched a campaign that's going to go after the NBA's partnership with the UAE. And later in the fall, winter, we will go out, we'll do similarly with the Premier League in England. Arsenal and Man City are the main offenders. My beloved Arsenal just standing on my, so I'm going to have to do something about that. So anyways, the idea being that to create some form of consequence, even though it's reputational, because the U.S. isn't going to do anything about the UAE because they're deep in Gaza, in the Gaza negotiations. They're the counterweight to Iran. There's all these other reasons why the U.S. and Europe are just going to sit on the sidelines with respect to what the UAE is doing in Sudan. So we have to take it on ourselves to do something. And so that, and for those that are interested, I'll be glad to give you. Well, I'll tell you right now. Avaz, if you've heard of that group that does action. Avaz has a bunch of actions on their website, and Refugees International is the group that is sort of leading us to, and they've got the website now on their microsite on their website, and how you can take action and lots of things you can do if you're so inclined. There's so much more we can do, I believe, So I urge all of you, for the issues that you care about, you probably don't need this urging because you wouldn't be here otherwise, but to sign the petitions, to write the letters about the things you care about, show up for the, whatever the manifestation of will and determination to change something, because it matters. It all matters. Like Amina said, in the story I told you at the beginning, now that you know, you must do something. Thank you.
Wow. Well, I want to open this up for discussion, but before we do that, I mean, there's so much to chew on. I want to talk more about the UAE, so I want you to dig a little deeper there on what are the entry points in terms of, I mean, is it the NBA, your beloved NBA? And if you go up against Adam Silver, you won't be invited to any more Celtics games. But the NBA has is a very powerful organization, and the sort of the engagement with the UAE, Dubai's position in the world, Dubai as and UAE as a position in the world. As you said, you mentioned its involvement in the Middle East negotiations and as a bulwark against other bulwark in favor of U.S. interests in the region and so on. So you've got a formidable opponent there, or set of opponents. Again, well, I want you to delve into that, but there's another. Well, no, but I mean, so just right, just sort of let that sort of percolate a little bit. But I wanted to ask about activism. A very specific question about activism. And as you're talking, and I'm reflecting on 20 years ago too, and I'm reflecting on, when the U.S. was particularly bad, as Professor Longman will talk about in the case of Rwanda, and the reluctant, the utter unwillingness of the Clinton administration to declare genocide. But then the Bush administration, when Colin Powell was Secretary of State, he declared genocide in Darfur. For whatever that meant, whatever happened, right? But the willingness to call attention to it. You said it was in the media back then. I mean, certainly it's not in the media now. And I'm wondering, I mean, the Save Darfur campaign. It was I was in D.C. at the time, at another campus, and it was incredible student activism around that. Incredible student activism against conflict minerals in Congo and genocide in Darfur. People were mobilized. Churches, synagogues were. I mean, you couldn't drive by a synagogue without "We Stand with Darfur" banner hanging from it, right? Campuses, churches, religious organizations, etc. It seems to me this is a totally different era. We're exhausted, right? Synagogues are preoccupied with Israel. The church community is divided. As you said, very, very few people are paying, and campuses, except for you all, a lot of us aren't paying attention. So I mean, I want to just comment on where does that activism, how do we regenerate that activism in the context of our divided attention, the number of crises in the world, our own, especially in the U.S., our own divisions in the U.S., and the U.S. government, the special envoy for Sudan. I think he's never even visited, right? Tom Perillo, he can't get in. So I mean, the U.S. government engagement in Sudan is de minimis. So where do we start?
So I think it's, I'm going to forget the first two ones, so we'll come back to it because it's really important. But to start with the last one, I think that I share your pessimism that a large-scale movement could be reconstituted at this moment. But just, it's not crazy though. Like what you've just described, some of you may not even know. Like the anti-apartheid movement in the late 70s through the 80s into the early 90s, like it captivated, it was students, churches, synagogue, largely the same kind of coalition. And it had a profound impact on U.S. policy because it drove Congress to ram comprehensive sanctions, which were being shouted for by every major constituency within South Africa at the top of their lungs, and led to U.S. policy just changing, despite the President of the United States being opposed completely to a policy of pressuring the South African government to change and so South Africa success, the next decade, late 90s, the world becomes more and more aware that there are these diamonds originating in West Africa and Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Angola that are coming out of these conflict zones, fueling conflict, and without any check and balance, ending up on people's engagement rings and earrings, and students, principally, young people organized over time, a campaign, the Blood Diamonds campaign, that eventually led to, I mean, we're talking about years. This doesn't happen overnight. We always want something to happen. Like years led to a international treaty that basically sought to squeeze all conflict diamonds, blood diamonds, diamonds that originated in conflict zones out of the international supply chain. And frankly speaking, you know, we can talk about all the other aspects of the reasons for this to happen, but the war ended in Sierra Leone, the war ended in Liberia, and the war eventually ended in Angola. A major source of the continuation of those conflicts was eliminated, and the incentive structure was altered. People who had been profiteering from the diamond trade became legitimate actors. Very little accountability understood. As a human rights person, it galls me that some of these people just put a new hat on instead of a military hat, a civilian hat. But the war's ended. You can't, there's nothing more profound than a country that's been at war and then it's at peace in terms of just basic security. And then some years after that, many of you will have heard of that quite unique, but not so after I've just described those other two movements, effort to try to end the scourge of terror unleashed by the Lord's Resistance Army, the Ugandan militia, which at its height was composed of roughly 30,000 militia and had led to the highest rate of child abductions in the world by far. Largely high school, but some college-driven organizing, some of it wildly simplistic, some of it horrifically white saviorish, led to policy changes, again, that led to the alliance between the United States military and other militaries in Africa to degrade the capacities of that LRA. It's about a 150-member militia now, deep in the woods, probably in maybe Central African Republic would be the majority of them. They're threatening almost no one. Occasionally you hear an abduction, terrible, but compared to what it was, I mean, it's a staggering success of activism, even though there's all kinds of asterisks because of the nature of the organizing group, Invisible Children, and what happened and blah, blah, blah. But the core issue of activism, creating change in the world, is undeniable, I think. And then I gave you the example of the Genocide Olympics and altering China's calculations, and then the conflict minerals stuff, which had an impact on a number of different companies in how they sourced their minerals for our phones and our laptops, and had a 10-year impact, but it's gone now. And sometimes that's the problem, is like with the Sudan case, people move on, they go off to this, and this wonderful coalition you just described doesn't exist anymore, and there's other perceived higher priorities, and getting everybody back together is probably impossible. But so in that case, for those, many probably in this room, who will by the end of your life describe yourself like I perceive myself, a lifer in trying to make a difference on a particular issue or set of issues, or and you become more strategic. You say, okay, well, given the limited firepower that we could ever muster, what shot could we take that might influence the situation somewhat? And so the shot we decided on was collectively, and it was a process of Sudanese groups and international organizations consulting with each other, talking about, well, what is the biggest factor, and it wasn't unanimous. There were others that thought, well, we got to get that peacekeeping force in, or the others that thought, the Egyptians, we got to get them out of here. They're just constant, whatever. Everybody had different views, but in the end, most said the Emirates were the biggest player, and they have this tremendous vulnerability because they care about how they're perceived, and they care about their massive investments in sports. So let's try to influence that. And so now I think to segue to the NBA, like it's funny, the NBA's three main, I don't know if this is monetarily exactly correct, but I think it is. The three main investors internationally that the NBA has cultivated are China, Rwanda, and the United Arab Emirates. And I don't think, I think most from Silver on down, the commissioner on down, by the way, before he knew I was going to go after it, I got tickets from him for the game 2 of the NBA Finals last year. I was right there, man. It was awesome, but that's the last time I'll ever get anything from him. And so their rhetoric is, oh, but we invest in like, these youth clinics, right? Of course, and so many kids are going to be turned on to basketball, and sports are such a way to bring people together. I'm like, la 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 la, and I think they believe it, and in some places maybe that's accurate, and it isn't inaccurate that it's great that young people have a new community center or a basketball court to play in, and it's like, okay, but but now you have members of Congress, senators writing letters to Adam Silver and the number 2 guy who always announces during the draft, Mark, forget his name, and they're having to answer, while the Rwandans are deployed in Eastern Congo, ripping that place to shreds, looting the country of their precious minerals, and the Emirates are sending arms, like deadly arms and munitions, to the deadliest war in the world. Like, the NBA, these are your allies? This is who you want to put. We've started to get meetings, where anyway, I can't get it, but we got somebody in there to meet certain, so and the social media campaign just began to start to question this. So I don't know if that answered your question, but we're trying to find, it's the David Goliath thing. Where's the slingshot? What do we aim it at? The little pebble from the river. Where's it going to hit? And will it, and if it does hit him in the head, does it even phase him? I don't know. It's a theory of change. So it's all an experiment.
I've got more, but why don't we open it up to the audience? So
I would like to apologize for my question ahead of time, because my question is a very big one, which would probably require several dissertation research. But I wonder, based on your experience and somebody who's been trying to grapple with this problem, right, issue, I wonder if you can have you have a gauge of some and I know the problem is complex, right? But I wonder if you can point to at least one causal factor that led us to this situation right now. Probably it's the history of colonialism, which led to lack of national identity. I don't know, but I want to hear from you as somebody who has more knowledge about the situation and the country, that if you can provide some kind of a answer,
Sure.
like a handle for us to understand where the cause.
And I think there are probably 10 really good answers to that question. Maybe more. And maybe people in this room would have better ones than me. But I'm gonna double down on something I said before. So and take it back for just, and I'll do 1 minute, because it's scary when somebody starts talking about what happened in 1732, because you don't know where they're going to go. You don't know how long it's going to take. But I guess this you guys could handle that, but I'm not going to do it. So the idea is the colonial, just to continue with part of the spirit of your question, arrangement, not just in Sudan, but in colonies around the world, was an arrangement of extraction. It was a looting machine. What's different? The names have changed, the arrangements, now it's local control. but in many places, the system of extracting resources for 2 centuries, it was people. You go all the way back into the 1500s, 1600s, the British, the Portuguese, and others, the transatlantic slave trade, and gold coming out, and rubber, and oh my God, everything, cobalt and copper, whatever. You look at any massive advance in industrial capacity, and the raw materials in part came from Africa because of these extractive mechanisms that were created in the pre-colonial and colonial eras, but pre-colonial being the invasion, and then the systems build up to continue to extract. So why would it? I'm always amazed when it does change, and there is a government that actually provides services that are and is responsive and has systems of participatory representation that reflect the will of the people. For general, like a place like Sudan and many of the other countries that worked on the rest of my entire life, they never had that because it went from the colonial power to a local entity replaced it that was equally interested in benefiting from the extractive state. And I think that's the factor. And until we alter those incentives, sorry to just bleed on about the same things, but this is where I've come to after years, and I really believe it. Until we can influence those incentives, until we can create a cost for those that benefit from war, from profiteering from war and authoritarianism and violence and state capture, I don't see the likelihood of major change.
This particular crisis, though, right? You had the overthrow of Bashir, and then a leadership vacuum that briefly looked like it would be occupied by civil society and progressive forces. And in that vacuum stepped, the Burhan and Hemeti. Yeah. Yeah.
So we'll just keep going. No, not by you. No, and by the way, I totally understand. So yeah, I don't know if there was a vacuum. I think that so when the dictator, who was the symbol in Sudan of the terrible things that had happened in Sudan, the rot, no longer served the interest of the system, he was sacrificed. No vacuum. And then they were like, let's let these people come in and see the civilian leadership that came in for a couple years. But what did they do? Understandably, they overreached. I 1000% supported the overreach. They started to talk about how can we create new terms that would allow for the prosecution of those that have hijacked the economy. And I figured they had a whole committee that was investigating the degree to which the armed forces and the militias had 100% monopolized the economy of the country and the resources of the country. And once that committee started moving, the coup occurs and the civilians are displaced, and these guys come together. The two bandits come together, two faction of bandits come together in an easy truce, because we had to get rid of the civilians, right? But once the civilians were gone, then they were looking at each other, and it was only a matter of time. Then they went to war, so they could be the sole controller of the looted assets. I actually don't think that's oversimplifying the situation.
Oh, there's a question here. So let's go here and then to Sarah. Yeah.
My name's Jacob. I'm a student here at Pardee for Masters in International Affairs. My question is looking a little bit forward, I guess, but I still think it's a little relevant. What about the after? there will be a winner of this conflict at some point. There will be an end. We saw the revolution happen with civilians getting in power. Does that look likely at the end of this? Will the military even want to transition? And even if civilians get in power by the end of this, how are they going to be able to address everything that's happened? Like the challenges are huge. So I'm just wondering, can we be optimistic about the after, even if this ends? And how can we here in the West best support the locals who are making that change? How can we support African solutions to African problems?
Okay, incredibly important questions. So I don't think there's an ending and a beginning. You may not have even meant that, but I just want to say that more generally. It's more of a potential, in a best case scenario, it's a morphine where some of the current system is disincentivized enough that there's a chance for some opening for some reform. So there's the getting there, and then what happens once we get there. Getting there, again, I'm doubling down, unless there is, and question of optimism versus pessimism, unless there's a alteration in the structural incentives, I don't see why it would change. I don't see why either party. I mean, what you're going to get in a worst case scenario is that the army, remnants of the army, control a certain part of the country, starting northeast, some parts of the east, maybe a little bit of the southeast, and this militia, as long as they're supported by the United Arab Emirates, continues to control Darfur, the west, and other parts, and they're pushing it now into the breadbasket of the Jazeera state. But it'll be, this kind of shifting border and unclear, but probably it could last. There's so much money being made. Again, there's all these resources. It's led by gold by far, and if people are going to arm them, and there's no pressure to create governing institutions, and there's no consequence for committing mass atrocities, I don't. But the longer it goes on, there's tipping points that occur in public. And what happened in the mid 2000s was that reached a tipping point. I did three episodes of 60 Minutes with 20 million, 30 million people watching this thing. Like, we took them in, Samantha and I, the first one, took them in to show what was happening. And then everybody wanted to go, like all the nightly news and everybody like set up on the border of Chad. It was unbelievable. Nightline at the time was the biggest night show, and all. This is when there was, so there, we could have a tipping point if millions starve. How horrible is it to say that? But with all of the other competing international and domestic events, it's hard to imagine. But even so, a set of policymakers who would emerge in Washington post-election potentially would say this should be a bigger priority. Potentially, I'm trying to be. You said I heard the word optimistic, so I'm going to try. And they would see that, in fact, it doesn't really take away from our efforts on other things if we put more effort into this, that in fact, the Emirates might actually see us having more of a backbone on things if we stood up for the principles that we claim to care about, and we stood up to them, even if it was private diplomacy, much more aggressively than we did otherwise, instead of kowtowing to them. And so, that's a potential movement, but that depends on a lot of things, as you all know. And so, the short answer is, if there was a significant intensification of pressure on the parties, And we were able to convince the Egyptians and the Emiratis and the Saudis to help find a solution. You could begin to alter. It wouldn't be the end and then the beginning of the civil, that, because none of those guys want a civilian. Like the Egyptians don't want a civilian, the Turks, like none of these want a civilian leader in the Emiratis. That just messes up their game plan. So, but could you have some kind of hybrid, what do you call those things when there are bureaucrats involved in the government? Technocratic administration, where, you know, it isn't quite elections per se, where it's like, you know, the UN observed and all that stuff. You know, maybe there's a middle ground, a hybrid thing that starts to emerge in places where Middle Eastern powers are the brokers, you know, because they're the ones, like this. I talked about the Cold War, when the Soviets and Americans were pouring arms into these countries and could call the shots. The Emiratis could call the shots with the RSF if it wanted to. So it would take leadership at a very, very high level that we did not have in this administration. So, and I think Tom Perriello is a fantastic envoy, and if they kept him on in whatever situation unfolds post-January, that would be great. But he's trying to do what he can do. But you got to have top-level decision-making that says we're willing to use our leverage, because we have huge leverage. The United States, this is the takeaway, if you have anything that you remember from this day, is why the U.S. still matters, even though politically we matter less and less in a lot of these places. But financially, I don't even see economically, because the aid and all that stuff doesn't matter to these countries in a lot of places. They don't care. Okay, thanks for taking care of the health and education systems. That's nice. But financially, because 65% of, maybe more, of the world's commercial transactions are still conducted in the dollar. That is unchanged since China has been trying to change that for the last 10 years. Because the dollar is so strong, and 65% might be an underestimate. So what the Treasury Department does on anti-money laundering stuff with global banks has enormous influence when it chooses to have that. And were it not for China completely underwriting what's going on in North Korea would have collapsed because of the kind of pressure. Everybody says, oh, sanctions, financial pressures failed in Russia so far. It's too soon. Watch, wait. That economy is going to implode. That government is going to run out of money. It's years. It takes years to do it. If you did that to these tin pot dictator over here and a militia with its little business interests, you take a hammer on those guys, it would change very quickly. It's completely different than a petrostate like Russia, or a completely underwritten situation like North Korea, or Iran with its oil, or you name it. There's a few places where they've been able to maintain in the face of sanctions and make it seem like a real financial pressure strategy can't work. But I would look at what happened in Iran when the world was united about preventing that country from achieving a nuclear weapon, and used negotiations to do it, and used a financial pressure strategy very specifically tied to that objective, and it worked. And they came to the negotiating table and they made a deal, but then of course politics ruined it all from our side. So, and I'm sure I'm now wading into territory where lots of opinions may be completely contrary to what I'm saying, but I do believe that there is a way to get us there that is within our control. The United States could be a major player in it. We have to work very closely with a number of other states in the world, including African governments like Uganda, like Egypt, and other, and then of course the Middle Eastern powers that are the key. But we could do it. I think we could do it. So I have moderate hope in the medium term, if a new administration commits as one of many things, the walking, the chewing gum, the whistling, the singing, all of the things that have to happen at the same time when you're conducting a foreign policy in a complex world, that Sudan could be prioritized, and it would be and will be, because the humanitarian crisis will be so enormous and will dwarf everything else. And once one major TV crew starts getting in there and those images start being seen of thousands and thousands and thousands of starving babies, I think that's going to have an impact. It's not the same because our information system and the way we take in information is balkanized so dramatically in the last 10 years, but that will take different forms, through 10-second videos to in-depth documentaries, all in between. And people will see that, in fact, there needs to be action, and maybe you'll have 2 or 3 officials who can spearhead a real dynamic policy that could lead to change.
So thank you. So I'm going to turn the conversation a little bit toward environment issues, because if you go back to Save Darfur, the early 2000s, many of the issues surrounding the issues of water, as the Nile made its way up from the south to the north and the 9 international borders of Sudan. If you looked at each of those areas, you would see a major source of conflict in control over the Nile. And if we think about activism today, where's a lot of it? It's on the environment issues. So my question is whether there are ways to connect. You're looking for new connections. Are there ways to connect the violence in Sudan now to the perennial water issues, which are extremely difficult issues right now, also to the larger activism around environment issues, and the way the interfaith religious communities organize themselves around these issues 40 years ago?
The flip side, the flip side of the coin, the same coin and the same theme to the Nile climate related issue is the decline, the reduction, the lowering of the water table in places like Darfur and Kordofan in the west of the country, where well water and rainwater and everything that has been the life source of agropastoralism for centuries is diminishing, and the livelihood opportunities for young people are as rapidly diminishing, have rapidly diminished, and thus recruitment of young men into militias became so much easier because the alternatives really didn't exist. Either you migrate to a town and there's no jobs and the educational system is a joke, or you continue to try to scrap out a living, increasingly difficult because of the longer and longer droughts and worse and worse torrential flooding, the extremities of climate, and then or you can join a militia and feed your community, because the spoils of militia membership are, the commanders let them take whatever they want, and they pay them, and the payments are often by thank you United Arab Emirates, and so the climate is a integral factor in the roots of why we are where we are today in Sudan and a number of other places where conflict exists. And there's been outreach to environmental groups, particularly in this latest round of effort to try to get a wider set of actors, and I think more needs to be done on that front. And I think your creative way of thinking is exactly the kind of desperate times, desperate measures. You've got to find your allies wherever you can get them, and so as this crisis unfolds and the lack of water and food becomes increasingly understood reason for mass death, recruitment of building of alliances with some of the environmental groups will become easier. So yes, the effort has begun, and we hope that your hypothesis becomes reality, because they do have influence and they have much bigger constituencies than we will ever have, and so that is definitely a thought on our side. We're reaching out, doing a lot of that. They are the core at this point of who would be who is taking action now. So yes, for sure, but in much diminished numbers from where we were back in the day.
Well, that brings us to an end. Thank you so much, all of you, for coming, for some really terrific and provocative questions. This is an issue, as I said at the outset, to which we, not only as a school, and not only as a school based in the U.S., but as global citizens, that we need to have more awareness of and more engagement with. It is an issue of profound human suffering, and I want to thank you, John Prendergast, my dear friend, for coming and helping to shed some light on this, and to helping us, continue this discussion at BU and Pardee. So thanks.